Hi everybody, Pastor Jimmy here. We're going to continue our study in Ruth. In the previous video we looked at Ruth chapter 2. And in that chapter we were introduced to Boaz. And so I want to spend some time going over some characteristics that Boaz showed to Ruth in chapter 2 and how we need to have some of these same characteristics in our life. I want us to look at who Boaz was and the importance of who he was to Ruth and how that will come in later chapters. So in this video, we're just going to get a look at the life of Boaz, who he was, and why he was so important in this story. And we're introduced to him right off the bat in chapter 2 and verse 1. It says, "There was a relative of Naomi's husband, a man of great wealth of the family of Elimelech. His name was Boaz." We won't see the significance of him being a family member until chapter 3, but in chapter 3 we see the importance. But as a relative of Naomi, understand this, he had responsibility to care for the needy members of his family, and Ruth and Naomi were them. But you have to remember that whenever we're introduced to Boaz here in chapter 2, verse 1, we don't know about his relationship with Ruth. We don't know that he owns a field that Ruth is going to go to. None of those things we know about. But we do know that he is a relative, and we know that that is very important. We do know that he was a man of great standing. He was a man of wealth. He had a lot of wealth. This was important. Why was this important? It wasn't important so that Ruth could go find someone that was wealthy. It was important because he was a relative. Because he was a relative, he had responsibilities for those needy in his family. And the Bible is showing us here that he had the means to be responsible for them. He had the wealth. He could provide for these two widows. And so the Bible's setting everything up as we're introduced to him. Probably the most important characteristic we see, though, is in verse 4. It says, "Now behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, 'The Lord be with you.' And they answered him, 'The Lord bless you.'" We see that he was a godly man in verse 4. We understand that he was a godly man. This statement, "The Lord be with you," this shows us something of his heart and of his character of Boaz. His workers loved him. They had a good relationship with him. You can often tell the character of a person by the character of a person who is in authority by seeing how that the people that are under him relate to him and how they respect him. By him saying, "The Lord be with you," it was a normal conversation for him. He wanted people to know about God. He wanted people to know that the Lord was important to him. It seems clear that he was a man of God here and that he knew God. He knew the Lord. He wanted to do what the Lord called him to do. He also passed that on to his men. It's obvious that his men, as they treated the way they treated Ruth, had that respect of the Lord that Boaz has showed them. We see from this it was obvious that Boaz stayed in Bethlehem during the hard times, during this famine when Elimelech and his family left. But Boaz stayed because he wanted to follow God. He had stayed in the place that the Lord had called him to be, and now he was there. So we see that he was a godly man. We also see that he was obedient to God. In verses 6 and 7 it says, "So the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered and said, 'It is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. And she said, "Please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves." So she came and has continued from morning until now, though she rested a little in the house." You see, his servants even knew the law of the Lord. They knew this. Boaz had taught them this and had told them this. And they were doing what the law of the Lord had said. In Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 19, it says, "When you reap your harvest in your field and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands." You see, Boaz was just following God's command whenever he allowed her in the field to pick up what was left over. He was an obedient man to God's word. But he took it farther. He was also a welcoming man. He was a welcoming man. In verse 8 we see him say, "Then Boaz said to Ruth, 'You will listen, my daughter, will you not? Do not go to glean in another field, nor go from here, but stay close to my young women.'" And then in verse 14 he says, "Now Boaz said to her at mealtime, 'Come here and eat of the bread and dip your piece of bread in the vinegar.' So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed parched grain to her, and she ate and was satisfied and kept some back." He was hospitable to her, even though she was a foreigner, a stranger in the land. He didn't treat her that way. He called her "my daughter." It was a very warm term, a very welcoming term. At the mealtime, he invited her to eat with him, sharing his food with her, sharing the best food. All of this for a stranger. He was a welcoming man for Ruth. He was a welcoming man. God had laid it up on his heart, and he was obedient to him. But he was also sensitive to her needs. Not only did he say, listen, don't go in the field, but he says, let your eyes be on the field which they reap, and go after them. He said, I've commanded my young men not to touch you. When you're thirsty, go get the water that is laid out for you. He was considerate of all of her needs. He was sensitive to her. He told her to stay with the servant girls, have companionship with them, have the water that you need when you're thirsty. Do what you need. This field basically is your field, is what he was saying. He was very sensitive to her needs, told the young men not to harass her or touch her, to be kind to her. This was the type of man that he was. I believe he would do this for any of the people that came that were needy to him. But he was also a great provider for Ruth and Naomi. 9 and 10 says, let your eyes be on the field which they reap, and go after them. Have I not commanded the young men not to touch you? And when you're thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn. So she fell on her face, bowed down to the ground, and said to him, why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner? He gave her protection. He gave her food. He gave her water. He provided all that she needed at that time. He was a provider for her. Not only for her, but for Naomi as well. He was a great provider, but he was more than a provider. He was very generous. When it was mealtime, he told her to come in and eat. When it was mealtime, he came in and gave her part of the best grain. He gave her part of all that he had there. Whenever it was time for her to go back in the field, listen to verses 14 through 16 and listen to how generous he was with her. So now Boaz said to her at mealtime, come here and eat of the bread, and dip your piece of bread in the vinegar. So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed parched grain to her, and she ate and was satisfied and kept some. And when she rose up to glean, Boaz commanded his young men, saying, let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. Also let grain from the bundles fall purposely for her. Leave it that she may glean, and do not rebuke her. He was a provider to the point of giving too much almost. He gave her the best meals at lunch, the same that he and his men were having. Then he gave his instructions to the men. He didn't say just let her get what she wanted. He told his men to pull out stalks for her to pick up, drop them on the ground unaware. Let some grain fall from the bundles purposely. This was such a beautiful reaction of Boaz. He wanted to bless Ruth, but he didn't want to dishonor her dignity by making her a charity case. So he allowed some grain to fall upon the ground purposely, supposedly on accident, so that she could pick it up. You see, Boaz was a man who allowed God to use him greatly. Many of his characteristics are ones that you and I need to have in our everyday lives. All of us can learn how to be more godly, how to be more obedient, welcoming, sensitive, providing, and generous to those around us. All of us have this purpose. All of us have this reason to do it, and we do it so that we can introduce people to Jesus Christ. That's why we want to do this. Boaz was a man who blessed Ruth by being godly, by being obedient to God's word, by being sensitive to her needs, by providing for her over and beyond what he had to. He was very generous to her, and he blessed her. How much of a blessing could you and I be to other people if we were more like Boaz? How much of a blessing could we be to those around us as we help them, as we live our lives for God and let him control us? Boaz teaches us how to be a blessing by showing favor to others. But he also teaches us the importance of being obedient to God's word. The importance of putting God's word into action is what he shows us. So you and I can learn that as we study God's word and we see what God's will is for our life, we need to put that in action into the lives of others. So I challenge you to look at the life of Boaz and then see how you can take God's word and put that in action in your life to bless others in God's name.